The gospel would have never come to Texas if they were still in Jerusalem. The uttermost parts of the world, that's probably what East Texas was. That's what God had in mind when he said that. But it had to leave Jerusalem to do that. On Highway 154, between my house and Quitman, if you take that drive, you notice some tree farms that are out there. And I've thought as I have driven by those tree farms that if I was a tree, that's where I would want to be. You're just in a perfect little row. You're sitting there planted by all these other trees that are just like you. And if trees can talk, and maybe they do, I don't know what trees do when we're not around, but they probably have great conversations and just enjoy one another. But you know, the owner of the land has no plans for them staying together. In fact, he's going to come along, whether they understand it or not, and uproot them and move them and replant them for greater purposes than just living along a highway. As much as they might like that, the owner has different plans for them, where they're going to be planted in all different places and have an impact there that they couldn't have beside that highway. The second thing is that God used persecution to scatter the church. You know, maybe they would have left Jerusalem anyway, but God probably shows us that they weren't going to be leaving in God's timing, because God kind of got the decision out of their hands and forced them out of the city limits. The word that is used in verse 3 is a strong word. In fact, it's used elsewhere to describe a wild boar, a wild pig, that devours the victim's body of its prey. Ravaging is the word that is used here. God put a lot of force behind getting them out of town, because that's what it took probably. I watched Apollo 13 this week, and I was reminded, back in the space program days, and you'd watch a spaceship take off from the launching pad, how much power was underneath that rocket to get it moving out of our atmosphere, away from this world. And then you not only had the first stage of blast off, you had the stages that would follow, where it'd reignite and explode again. It took all of that to get them moving. Sometimes we don't understand what God is doing, but maybe it takes that to get us moving. Because our tendency is comfort, is ease, is not to necessarily do the things we're called to do in Scripture. Then God has to get us going. Now, how was God going to get Joseph in the Old Testament to get a message to Pharaoh? Joseph couldn't have just walked into Pharaoh's palace. God had to get him sold by his brothers into slavery, bought into Potiphar's house, run into a situation where he was falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, thrown in prison, sitting in prison for years, until finally a moment of interpreting dreams would allow him to get into the very palace itself and to save his brothers and family and all the descendants that would come after that. Joseph didn't understand that, I'm sure. I wouldn't have understood that. It made no sense. Joseph probably thought, I'm a nice guy. I love God. Why is God doing this? But God had a purpose. And ultimately, Joseph stood up and said, to his brothers, what you did for evil, for harm, God meant it for good. God used persecution to scatter the church.